What you wanna know?
What's going on, people? Mike C-Town here with another episode of What Do You Want to Know? Where you ask your questions. If I like your questions, I answer your questions on camera. So, I have a really good question here, so I'm going to jump right into it. It comes from a person named Gigi Bodeath. And the question is, hey Mike, I know you come from a hardcore background from your youth and were around fairly close to the beginnings of metalcore, so I was hoping you'd be able to drop some knowledge and insight on a dispute that me and other hardcore fans are having regarding the origin of metalcore. Obviously, it started when hardcore bands wanted to play hardcore with metallic qualities like the guitar tone, while somewhat maintaining the same vocal style and DIY ethic. Then there's the infamous breakdowns. So the dispute is if the breakdown came from metal or hardcore. Other people insist that it was adopted from hardcore, but I heard breakdowns being used by metal bands like Slayer and Sepultura before I heard hardcore bands using them. So according to you, where did the breakdown in the context of heavy music come from? If I'm wrong and it was from hardcore, what are some examples of hardcore bands using them that predate the usage in metal? Dude, this is actually a really good question. So, yeah, I got into hardcore back in 1992, 1993, somewhere around there when I was in high school. And I was already into punk rock, but along with my friend Brad, we kind of found the hardcore scene together. And I won't tell that story. I'll save that for another video. But I would venture to say that when I got into hardcore, that was around the time that bands were really experimenting with metal. You know, especially death metal and the heavier side of thrash. But let's take it back for a minute. Breakdowns were definitely prevalent in the hardcore scene back in the 80s. And from what I can tell, this came from the New York hardcore scene. Not really the youth crew stuff like Youth of Today, Bold, or Gorilla Biscuits, but more so the tougher bands like Agnostic Front, Cro-Mags, Judge. Now, the thing to note here is that the breakdown that these bands did back then, which back then we didn't call them breakdowns, we just called them mosh parts, semantics. But the breakdowns that these guys did, they were not the type of breakdowns that you're used to now with the modern metalcore bands. Back then, they were just slightly slower parts meant to kind of break up the monotony of the verse, chorus, verse style of punk rock. And if you're not really sure what I mean, go check out the song World Peace by Cro-Mags, or check out Your Mistake by Agnostic Front. Go check out Take Me Away by Judge. Now moving on into the 90s, the bands got heavier and heavier, and they borrowed a lot of elements from metal at this point. And the breakdowns, they morphed into something that was slower and heavier. Palm mutes, cymbal crashes, pointed guitars. Now I definitely feel like those breakdowns were definitely influenced by metal. But it was almost a cyclical thing. So as I said, the earlier 80s hardcore bands, they had breakdowns, even though they were a little bit different than what we expect. But I think that the thrash bands around that time, like Slayer, Creator, Sepultura, Destruction, Anthrax, and even Metallica, I think that those bands kind of took those ideas of the breakdown. They kind of created their own version, which was a little bit heavier. That idea carried over into the 90s with other heavier metal bands like Pantera, who I think influenced the 90s hardcore breakdowns a lot, along with Slayer with songs like Rain and Blood and At Dawn They Sleep. So it went from hardcore punk to metal, and then it bounced right back to hardcore. They were borrowing from each other, and it kind of formed this weird symbiotic, kind of incestuous relationship. So the 90s had bands like Earth Crisis, Snapcase, Chokehold, Hatebreed, Integrity. And now the breakdowns that these bands used and were known for, in my opinion, were adopted from metal, specifically death metal. Bands like Suffocation, bands like Cannibal Corpse. So the way I see it, the hardcore bands kind of borrowed what the metal bands were doing with their version of the breakdown that the metal bands borrowed from the hardcore bands. And then the hardcore bands took what the metal bands had now changed the breakdown into, and then they played their own more stripped down, more primitive version of those breakdowns. And then some will say, because the hardcore bands weren't quite as good at playing their instruments, that's why their breakdowns were more simplistic. I don't know if that's the case, or if they just wanted to kind of play them in a way that better fit their style. But if you listen to the breakdown in Metallica's One, you know what I'm talking about. If you listen to that breakdown is basically what all metal hardcore breakdowns became. They just became a slower, more simplistic version. So it went from to hopefully that makes sense and I didn't just do that weird Beavis and Butthead thing for no reason at all. Now here's the thing, I don't know shit about modern day metalcore. I don't like most of it, I don't listen to it. I loved metal hardcore like fucking Bloodlet, Integrity, Converge, Catharsis, fucking Unbroken, Starkweather, all that shit, but metalcore, deathcore, slamcore, shitcore, porncore, most of that stuff is just not interesting to me at all. I don't really shit on it, it's just not my fucking thing. But if there's one person I know who knows all about that stuff, it's my man Count Blagorath. And the second I read this question, the first thing I thought was, damn, this would be a great question for him. So guess what? I got him here to give his take on the situation. Take it away, Count.
What's up, everyone? Sean Count Blagorath here. The question I am here to answer is, so the dispute is if the breakdown came from metal or hardcore. Other people insist that it was adopted from hardcore, but I heard breakdowns being used by metal bands like Slayer and Sepultura before I heard hardcore bands using them. With that statement, I can see where some people would say that it kind of originated from metal, but in my personal opinion, based off listening to a lot of different types of bands, I would say that it did come from hardcore first, especially considering a band like Slayer was heavily influenced by hardcore punk, and that was really sort of a big influence upon thrash metal as a whole. That's where a lot of like some of the more two-step beats come into play within thrash metal and shit like that. When it comes to the breakdown, I would say the breakdown that we know, like modern metalcore today, comes more from the metal side than the hardcore punk side. Because even nowadays, if you're to listen to a straight-up hardcore band and hear their breakdowns, and listen to like a modern metalcore or deathcore band, the breakdowns are on vastly different levels. I feel like hardcore has a more consistent sort of beat to it, and it doesn't really stray away too much in terms of tempo, whereas like metalcore and deathcore nowadays are really about changing the tempo and slowing it down and just kind of throwing a fucking wrench into the speed that they built up with the song, which is kind of the point of it. And I would say that that sort of breakdown more or less originates from bands like Pantera, where it had a much chuggier sort of sound to it, and then some bands took it a step further within metalcore in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, which is where I'm more familiar with metalcore, because I got into metalcore when I was about 13 or so, and that was, I believe, 2003, 2004. Bands like Sinai Beach and Norma Jean definitely had more of a hardcore punk aspect to their breakdowns, but then there was other bands such as As I Lay Dying that kind of took it and put it in more of a metal direction. With their already Gothenburg influenced sound, it had more of those almost Pantera-esque breakdowns, but not fully. And nowadays, breakdowns are a shell of what they used to be. Nowadays, what used to be considered a breakdown really isn't. And it's more or less just kind of just a somewhat slower tempo section of a song. Whereas nowadays, it's this very overbearing thing, and that kind of came from the mid-2000 bands, as I said, like As I Lay Dying, Suicide Silence. Bands like that kind of push the envelope in terms of what a breakdown could be. Because as I said, a lot before that was much more rooted in both metal and hardcore. It was kind of a combination of both. So the origins are kind of blurry in my opinion. Breakdowns are definitely more of a hardcore punk thing, but metal bands kind of took it and changed the entire face of it, which is where the modern breakdown comes in. And I really hope this answers the question. And if not, I am very sorry I wasted your time. So that's my thoughts on it. And yeah.
So I want to give a quick thank you to Count Blagorath for helping me out here. But before we wrap this up, I want to give one quick side note. And that is that I think one of the best, hardest, most mosh-worthy breakdowns to ever be played in heavy music ever is the breakdown in Sabbath Bloody Sabbath by Black Sabbath. And that song predates all of the shit that we're talking about here. So we all know that heavy music in general can be traced all the way back to Sabbath. But I think it would be interesting to make an argument that the breakdown itself can be traced back to Black Sabbath. I'm not making that argument, but if somebody else wants to, I'd love to hear it. I don't know. Either way, these are my takes. Once again, thank you to the Count. His information is in the description section down there. Make sure you go check out his channel, subscribe, all that good shit. And as usual, thank you for living, thank you for loving, thank you for being you. Please don't die, and I'll see you guys next time. Alright?